anyone gets disconnected. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to CONSALD's faculty representative, Dr. Shah Mahmoud Hanifi, and he is going to talk to us about a research biography in Afghanistan studies. Thank you, Dr. Hanifi, and take it away.
Thank you very much, Mara, not just for the introduction, but really for all you do for CONSALD. And it's been a really, I think, rewarding experience from the SAC perspective to kind of reconstitute a dormant relationship with CONSALD. I've just left the SAC meeting, and I speak for the collective that we're really happy to be back in touch with you. And I'll be rotating off, but I am anxious to see the relationship continue. I work on Afghanistan, and my sort of goal here today is to share with you some of the wide array of source material related to Afghanistan. And in that sense, I have prepared this very extensive PowerPoint presentation that I know just got sent out. I had not been aware that I would be able to walk through the PowerPoint with you now, which is what I intend to do. You'll see there's a huge number of images, and we'll have to go through kind of picking and choosing which ones we focus on. But in general, they will carry through a chronology that's broadly outlined here on this slide, with the caveat that I'd like to say, as anyone who has a single biography knows, each era or phase is kind of connected to the subsequent era or phase in ways that I'll try to illuminate as we go forward. But in broad measure, I just want to speak to this geography of Afghanistan, where source material about it is indeed found far beyond it, in that we can go all around the world and find relevant material related to Afghanistan. And of course, our job from the library perspective is to focus on the textual, and we'll do that. But I do want to draw attention to other sort of bodies of data, whether it's either visual or even kind of geographic or architectural, that does come, of course, to bear in the world of libraries. So in my case, I began working on Afghanistan from the West. That is, I entered my studies at the University of Michigan wanting to do the Middle East. And so I came at Afghanistan from its Western sort of side. And gradually, in the course of my graduate career, became exposed to Afghanistan's eastern side, that is British India. And it's of course British India where there's just an incredible array of sources related to Afghanistan, despite Afghanistan's kind of marginal position in British India. When it comes to colonial sources, we need to identify the key location, which would be the British Library. And indeed, the South Asian bibliographer there for sort of company materials is Antonia Moon. Antonia Moon, for those of you that would like that reference or who may know of her, as someone who would be kind of the expert at the British Library for colonial sources related to Afghanistan. I would say the second largest body of material related to Afghanistan is, of course, Persian and Pashto materials. And what we see recently in the academy is a real surge in especially early modern Persianate sort of reckonings with the geography of Afghanistan. There's a number of young professors out there or recent PhDs who have been trained in kind of early modern Persian studies. That is, again, a great windfall of good fortune for Afghanistan studies. I think Ryan, our colleague at Stanford, could speak to the wider array, not just of Persian and Pashto, but also Urdu and even other South Asian languages producing material relevant to Afghanistan, and maybe at a future time, Ryan, for example, could talk about the source materials in Urdu related to Afghanistan held in Pakistan or something along those lines. With those sort of broad introductory comments in mind, I'd like to begin with my good fortune of being at the University of Michigan, where I worked with Juan Cole as my primary advisor. And those of you who know Juan Cole know he has a foot in, of course, the Middle East and Iran and Islam, but also in South Asia. And I had the real just great fortune of entering Michigan kind of right with Juan as an incoming professor. And it was his understanding of Afghanistan straddling the regional studies boundaries between the Middle East and South Asia that I'm so grateful for. I'm also grateful to have the South Asianists at Michigan, Nicholas Dirks, who left before I completed, but Tom Troutman remains a close friend of mine and someone who really made me aware of, again, Afghanistan's connections to South Asia. And it's with their support that I got funding to pursue my doctoral research in South Asia, having been kind of forced to reconfigure my research aims as a graduate student because of the Gulf War in Iraq, where I had targeted some material in Baghdad. And so I kind of am a refugee, more or less, in South Asian studies, but it's a natural home for Afghanistan in so many ways, historically and culturally. And I think that's the most important thing to recognize, is Afghanistan's sort of being between Iran and India culturally, historically, is the most important thing to appreciate. To capitalize on those relationships is what I'm trying to do in my career. So my first exposure to colonial materials on Afghanistan came without any real training in the complications of British colonial materials. I ended up working, I'm sorry, this isn't a great slide, working primarily in Peshawar. I was based in Peshawar for a couple of years, working at the Northwest Frontier Provincial Archives then, now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Archives, as well as the Tribal Affairs Research Cell, which of course is now defunct, but had just split off from the archives during my years of research there in the 1990s. And so I also worked at the National Documentation Center in Islamabad with their microfilm materials, and that was just an excellent experience. And so my base was Peshawar in Pakistan, but I also had a base in New Delhi in India for about a year, working at the National Archives of India primarily, but also at Aligarh Muslim University and some other surveying of archives and libraries in the north in places like Patna and Rampur. Again, looking in those instances more for the Persian and Pashto materials rather than the colonial archival materials I ultimately really built my thesis and book on. That's not to say that there wasn't Persian language sources that I came across or textual visuals like maps that were relevant. Printed materials, colonial materials also really gave me the foundation for a doctoral thesis. And when I completed my thesis at the University of Michigan, literally in 2001, literally on the day that the United States began bombing in Afghanistan on October 8th, I was granted my degree. And of course, the world looked very different between September 10th and September 12th. It was an interesting time, but my dissertation, perhaps because of geopolitics, got awarded a prize at the University of Michigan that allowed me to apply for a Gutenberg E fellowship to convert my dissertation into a book. And it's that my first book, therefore, was Born Digital, and it's online, Gutenberg-E, where you'll see a whole range of first books by younger scholars. And what that digital birth of my first book allowed me to do was get exposed to photographs and maps in ways that I had not previously had the benefit of thinking through. But my first project after completing my thesis and getting my job at the James Madison University was to work on the history of the Pashto language. That is, the colonial officer named Henry George Rafferty, who is clearly the most foremost colonial authority on the Pashto language. And through that, kind of a history of Pashto is what I got into, and the history of early Pashto printing, the sort of framing of Pashto by Sir William Jones, and then again, the career of Henry George Rafferty. I ended up writing on him and Pashto in a single article that exposed me to some of the real complexities for librarians and bibliographers about cataloging Pashto manuscripts on the one hand, but indeed even Dari Persian manuscripts, where in Dari, the sort of Afghan Persian, we don't really have a V, so the wow becomes a wa, so Wardak would be a tribal group, not Vardak, which is the Library of Congress transliteration scheme for wow. And these sort of complications in terms of cataloging are especially apparent when it comes to Pashto. And I think Orion and John at the Library of Congress and his new colleague there, Charlotte, can talk to you in more detail about some of the bibliographic challenges. And again, this is from Rafferty's work, where Rafferty's complex approach to Pashto did not get adopted by the colonial exam system for these languages that adopted a far more simplistic regimen for Pashto that got institutionalized. In other words, a version of Pashto that only had 20 letters rather than the 40 letters that Rafferty had identified. And of course, the consequences of this are profound for all of us. And that will essentially leave my Pashto material behind. I'd like to move now to where I got a sort of appreciation for the wealth of visual cultural materials, the wealth of lithographs and the wealth of photographs, some of which are quite famous, such as these of Amir Sher Ali at a conference in Ambala in 1869, other famous photographs of the Gandamak sort of treaty. But we have a huge number of visual materials in the public sphere and as well as in private collections that have really enhanced my understanding of Afghanistan. For example, I wrote about the industrial workshops in my first book, but I never really knew what they looked like on the inside until these photographs gave me a sense for some of the machinery that indeed opens up new research trajectories, because these come from in essentially the Midlands of the UK. And so, you know, in the longer term, this technology has a history that opens up a research possibility. And it's the steam-driven technologies of the industrial workshops in Afghanistan that led to the deforestation of the country that I see now. So again, some of these photographs help me see some of the landscape, the historic landscapes that have really just enhanced my understanding of Afghanistan and raised a lot of questions for bibliographers and librarians about visual materials that are so important and readily available for Afghanistan. There are thousands, and I want to say that again, thousands of pictures from the early 20th century in Afghanistan that show a sort of changing political habitus for the rulers as they become really sort of infatuated with Western technologies and fashions and pastimes. In Iran, this is known as Gharbzadagi, a sort of infatuation with the West. And we have evidence of that from the interior spaces of palaces in Kabul that are, it's just a fascinating visual repertoire of the first school groups of Afghan students being sent abroad in the 1920s. These photographs give us an excellent sense of, for example, the people who form the constituency for the first parliament, known as the Loya Jirga in Afghanistan, are photographed in their tribal, traditional local dress when they arrive, and then in the state uniforms when they depart. And once again, the kind of power of the visual sources for Afghanistan have been especially important for me, again, in broadening my understanding from a sort of colonial political economy to other kinds of cultural and aesthetic dimensions, as well as the environment we can see here with elephants that I have again written about. Because it's through photography that I got exposed to essentially the history of landscape photography. And it's through that that I developed an environmental kind of appreciation. My second book is based on the figure Mount Stuart Elphinstone, who is a huge figure in the history of British colonialism, as an author of a history of India, as a governor of Mumbai, as someone who has a college named after him in Mumbai, Elphinstone College. And so Elphinstone has a real prominence in colonial history of India, but he also wrote the first kind of colonial encyclopedia of Afghanistan, an account of the Kingdom of Kabul. And in that sense, Elphinstone has kind of two lives, one as an Indianist and one as an Afghanist. And my latest book on Elphinstone is designed really to bridge that gap between Elphinstone's two professional lives. In so doing, I've got back into Elphinstone's archives at the British Library and began to really appreciate essentially kind of the paleography of colonial archives that shift from really rather individualized handwriting. Elphinstone had horrible handwriting, to more standardized handwriting that appears in a lot of colonial documents. Elphinstone's mission to Afghanistan has a lot of financial accounting materials in other languages, hundis and hawalas in other languages that are really just excellent, and again speak to non-English and non-Persian sources related to Afghanistan. Just an example of Elphinstone's handwriting. But just to tell you what I am intellectually interested in was Mount Stuart Elphinstone's sort of status as the founding father, more or less, of Afghanistan studies, with the book called An Account of the Kingdom of Kabul that made him so famous in that field. And what I do in my research here is look at the history of maps and mapping. And Elphinstone's first map of Afghanistan, as you can see, is not of Afghanistan, but it's of the Kingdom of Kabul. And essentially my first book sort of took the evolution of a Kingdom of Kabul into a nation state of Afghanistan from the history of political economy. And what the study of published maps, such as Elphinstone's, published in his book, really stand very much opposed to the archived maps from this mission at the British Library that give very different readings of the demography. And if I could just put out a principle when it comes to Afghanistan studies, that's the relationship between Persian speakers, often known as Tajiks, in Afghanistan, and Pashto speakers, identified as either Pashtuns or Pathans in the history of South Asia. And what Elphinstone's work had the consequence of doing was positioning Pashtuns at the cultural and historic core of this thing that became Afghanistan, this thing that became a Kabul-centric Afghanistan. A Pashto and Pashtun-centric, Kabul-centric Afghanistan is what Elphinstone leaves for posterity. The archives reveal a very different reading of the demography, where the chief surveyor of the mission actually separates the two main Pashtun groups from the groups we would identify as Afghans. And so whereas Elphinstone kind of made Afghan and Pashtun symmetrical, the archives, like they tend to do, reveal the inconsistencies and contradictions of colonial knowledge when it comes to Afghanistan. I've carried my, thanks to the work of John at the Library of Congress and his colleague Hirad Dinawadi, I've carried my interest in maps to the Library of Congress, where maps from the early modern and even medieval period have Afghanistan kind of mapped in ways that are very interesting for scholars. And I'll just give you a sense for the misplacement of Kabul being to the south of Kandahar in these maps, opposed to what we know today, the juxtaposition. The maps also have a great emphasis on animals in them, and some of the kind of visual components of maps draw my attention as a researcher, as does the visual material in Elphinstone's book, and it's part of a larger Orientalist aesthetic culture, which also gets us to Afghanistan and how Afghanistan, in terms of its own intellectual production, adopts a lot of colonial frames of reference, and particularly when it comes to Orientalist imagery. But when it comes to imagery of Afghanistan, it's the Babur Nama, the memoirs of Babur that were illustrated by his grandson Akbar, that give us a tremendous amount of visual material as well as textual material about the region around Kabul, known as Afghanistan. And essentially, I'm positioning Babur here as the first more or less environmental historian of Afghanistan, the Kabul region, for both visual and textual terms. Very quickly, the Americans get involved in Afghanistan beginning in the early 20th century, such that by the 1940s, we have American baseball played and in Kabul, and American a legation take shape under Cornelius Van H. Engert, whose archives are at Georgetown University. And they are extremely rich and a great source for the 1930s and 1940s burgeoning American interests in the country. And I mention that because there are a lot of sources related to Afghanistan found all over the world, including at Harvard, where Louis Dupree has a huge reservoir of archaeological photographs that again speak to not just archaeology, but also the landscape. At Harvard, there's also the Fine Arts Library, where there's a digital collection by the American journalist Lowell Thomas, who took photographs in Afghanistan in the 1920s that again, just give us a tremendous amount of visual resources at libraries in the United States. Most importantly though, it's the National Archives at College Park, Maryland, that open up a tremendous amount of resources for students of Afghanistan alone, but particularly the United States relationship to the country, beginning in the 1930s, organized around the Helmand Valley Project, which is a hydroelectric damming project for the South and Southwest Afghanistan. It's that era that opens up not just a documentary reservoir, but for me, information about the environment, particularly its Afghanistan's water supply, its rivers, the kind of irrigation and hydraulic technologies that Afghanistan depends upon, the international interest in these water supplies opens up a whole new range of NGO and UN statistical and satellite imagery of Afghanistan and its natural resources that are so relevant for what can and will be my next book, which is an environmental history of Afghanistan. But I just want to bring the natural resources of Afghanistan into play as a sort of source for us to think about. I wanted to share these with you for their deceptiveness. And we can see Afghanistan more or less in the dark here, which is really deceptive because, as you know, Afghanistan is absorbing the brunt of the world's coercive force now in the form of a war on terror. And there's been a tremendous environmental impact from the wars in Afghanistan. And there's a tremendous environmental impact for climate change in Afghanistan. And we can see just very quickly glacier melt from just less than a decade ago, just catastrophic in Afghanistan, with a very diverse ecology experiencing all the pernicious effects of various effects of global warming and climate change, from floods and flooding, again related to rivers, to what become the bombs and bombing of Afghanistan, the mother of all bombs that leaves depleted uranium in the groundwater of Afghanistan. That is of global consequences. And I need to draw that to your attention. Again, so water supply for an environmental approach, but also wood and timber. The United States now sees the timber export as part of a war on terror and sort of terrorist funding strategies, but there's a deep history of wood and trees. And I would argue Afghanistan is a wood culture in so many ways that has opened up an understanding for me that our good friend Rich Ritchie at Yale has been able to help me looking through the Indian Forester, where information about Afghanistan is held. And I thank Rich for making this available to me recently. There's a World Wood Library at the Forest Research Institute in Dehradun that I just visited this summer. Again, that speaks to sources of information about Afghanistan. Finally, I want to conclude, I know we're short, with sources about Afghanistan inside the country, whether they're citizenship documents held here by Afghans themselves, or materials at the National Archive or in personal libraries inside Afghanistan, as well as in diaspora, in places like Germany and elsewhere, where we can see, again, the kind of diglossia effect that in the fall, our speaker on essentially Southeast Asia addressed the kind of diglossia effect. And here we see that taking shape with Persian and Pashto. In other words, a Pashto format for a citizenship document that's filled in by the bureaucrats with Persian writing, all of which poses bibliographic challenges for us. And I have to thank all of the librarians who are attentive to Afghanistan's place in South Asia and helping students gain access to resources. Afghanistan is a human library that has yet to be read. We're just starting to read it, and it's with your work in libraries, at colleges and university, that we can reproduce an interest in the country and expose students to the wealth of sources about it and new perspectives well beyond ethnic thematics that can open up new ways of thinking about the country in relation to South Asia, in relation to the United States, and indeed the world. So I am so grateful for this opportunity, Mara. Thank you so much. I hope I haven't gone over time. Thank you.
Oh, we actually cut the last thing on the schedule where we've been ahead of schedule. Thank you for this fascinating presentation. I think it's your research shows it's a real testament to the notion of the value of a national collection, as you've taken resources from so many different libraries and cultural institutions across the United States and then beyond. So I think we have some time for a few questions. If anybody has any, I will take myself, I'll put myself on mute, and if anyone has any questions, now would be a great time to ask them.
I have a question, Mara. So thank you so much for the presentation. It was really rich and wonderful for us to hear. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about it was very clear as you were walking us through the sources for your different projects, how your questions and ideas were really built from those archives and how we could follow your path in discovering new resources in different archives. And one of the things that we've been talking a lot about is how to build such a rich and robust archive for the future now with the collecting that we're doing now. And this is something that Mary Rader has talked about in detail, and so she might want to chime in here too. But my question for you is, when we imagine 50 or 100 years from now, what are the kinds of things for Afghanistan that you think we should be focusing on collecting now, both in terms of topics, which you've mentioned the environment specifically, which is very critical, but also in terms of physical genres that you think are going to be of high research value? So whether that means maps, like you said, or ephemera, or serials, that kind of thing.
Well, thank you so much for the question. I'm sorry, I don't know to whom can I thank for the question? I don't know who to thank for this question.
I'm Ellen Ambrosoni. I'm the South Asian Studies librarian at Princeton.
Ellen, thank you so much. I know we've had some communication over
Sure.
email. I think the first thing to be, and I am so sad to say this, we need to be prepared for Afghanistan to be off the map in 50 years. We need to be prepared for that. Just as Afghanistan emerged in the 18th century, kind of out of the kingdom of Kabul, we need to be prepared for it to sort of devolve, if that's the right word, into, let's just take Greater Pashtunistan as some possible, not that I'm advocating that, but that would be my first note, that Afghanistan itself may be a historical relic in 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry to say that. So saying that, though, it makes me realize that what Afghanistan has is a series of very robust cross-border connections. And so when I think of, for example, Herat, whether it's a part of or not a part of Afghanistan in 50 years, in its own right, Herat offered, there's, I think, just one substantive, there's been a recent, so maybe two now, substantive monographs on that historic city. What I would say with Herat's potential for future scholarship and librarians is to kind of capture this Persianate wave. When I think of the North in Afghanistan, I think of Mazar-e-Sharif, and I think of the connections to Russian archives. And I haven't said anything about Russian source material on Afghanistan. My thinking along these lines in 50 years is to look at the regions of Afghanistan connected to their transboundary larger historic spaces, whether that's Khorasan in the case of Herat, or maybe a sort of Turkestan when it comes to Mazar-e-Sharif. And, again, the whole point here is to think beyond Kabul. The problem with thinking about Afghanistan is thinking through Kabul, which is much more the historic exception rather than the historic rule to what goes on in Afghanistan, in my view.
Thank you so much.
I have a question. I think as a scholar, I hear from a lot of scholars who have gone to India, for example, for doing research and have real difficulty accessing, archives and to be able to like spend time in the archives. How difficult or easy it was for you to go to different archives, and your research is so thorough, and you did a wonderful presentation. I was surprised to see the library where they have this wood collection, something that I could not even think of. So I am very curious to know, what was your experience while you were going from one archive to another, looking at materials for your research?
Sure. Well, I need to situate most of my archival work in the context of the 1990s, that is importantly pre-9/11. And I need to situate my own sort of, biography as an Afghan myself in Pakistan, in Peshawar in particular, that Peshawar was just a really open place. So I was able to work really effectively there. And when it comes, and I think the important point here is that I conducted work on Afghanistan in both Pakistan and India. And that is a rarity. That is the sort of ability for any scholar to do work in both locations. It certainly happens, but as you know, it's more an exception than the rule. In my case, I had such good fortune of being, I could be wrong, but I might have been the first person to receive joint clearance from both AIIS and AIPS through KYORK. I had the first multi-country fellowship, I'm told, to India and Pakistan. And so I think that opened up the prospects for me in ways that might be different for a student, let's say, that kind of comes from either a Pakistan or an India perspective when it comes to Afghanistan. But I must also say a word about the use of archives and libraries within Afghanistan by Afghans ourselves, but also by outsiders. And in Afghanistan, it's actually outsiders that have had better luck at the National Archives, so far as I can tell, than local scholars. For whatever reason, that gets, I think, into complicated institutional and personality discussions. But your question really raises the sort of specter that it's easier to do work on Afghanistan outside of Afghanistan at the moment. And hopefully that will change.
Thank you.
I'm sorry if that doesn't specifically answer your question.
I just want to say thank you for that great presentation. This is Ryan. And one of the things I'm finding is even historical videos are being uploaded on YouTube. So I'm starting to turn back to a project on Ajib Khan, who in 1923 had taken captive Major Ellis's daughter. And, find an interview on YouTube last night with his son that was probably recorded in the 90s, and then this old, documentary, which I'd never seen before, where interviews with Olaf Cairo and Molly Ellis when she was older and stuff. So I think it's really cool to see these other sources that I had no idea about, just going on YouTube and finding these things. And then, yeah, in terms of like working in, Kabul, I had taken, one research trip to Afghanistan and spent some time in Kabul and stayed at the American Institute of Afghan Studies guest house there. But, everywhere basically I would go, they'd be like, someone would say, oh, there was this bomb was here and this many people were killed. So it definitely, it's not like an ideal situation, but, there's other, and I was just there for a couple, for a few weeks or so, but there's others who, obviously spend more time there, but I found people to be very helpful, at least. But again, I'm coming from the outside and not, an Afghan myself, so there's other, issues involved there.
And just to follow up, Ryan, so nice to hear you and see you. There are individual families that do have libraries that are desperately looking for ways to get it scanned and preserved or safeguarded in some ways. There's so in other words, while bombs do go off and destroy archives, people do anticipate the violence and do move their materials. And, it's quite a complex undertaking to try to identify all of the, and again, we're speaking here primarily of books and textual records in Afghanistan. But your point, Ryan, if I could just follow up on the kind of videos and visual YouTube, that's fantastic stuff. There's a very important episode in Afghanistan's history where the king Amanullah went on a European tour to places like London in 1927-28. And there are videos of that kind of from England that are useful. One of the students, Ryan, at Stanford, I don't know if she's finished yet, Mesham Masumi, working on Kabul radio.
Yeah.
So kind of the history of the radio, it's just so important for Afghanistan. The radio, again, so important as a medium of communication exchange, far more important than visuals historically. Yeah, thanks, Ryan.
Well, thank you very much for that presentation, and thank you everyone for your questions. And thanks again for your service as one of our first in recent years faculty representatives. We'll miss you on the executive committee, but I'm sure we'll see you around. So yeah, so last